Minister. Then on my immediate left, a familiar figure to Senegal and in fact to Africa, I would say. We have Monsieur Jean-Yves Le Drian, and he is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France. Vous êtes le bienvenu, cher frère. And on the right of Minister Pandor, we have Mr. Samek Shukri, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. You're most welcome, my dear brother. And on the left of Yves Le Drian, we have Mr. Robert K. Scott. He is United States Deputy Secretary of State for African Affairs. You're most welcome, Robert. And the extreme right, you have Monsieur Ibrahima Sokefal. He is the Assistant Director General in the World Health Organization. And in the empty chair of the extreme left, whenever she shows up, we have Miss Finda Koroma, who is the Vice President of ECOWAS. So we better get started because we have 1 hour and 7 panelists. So let me start. Unfortunately, I think it was not quite clear to the panelists the format that this session would take. So there's some that have prepared, speaking speeches, more or less, and so on. But what I had proposed to do was to throw out 1 or 2 questions to each panelist, and they have about 7 minutes in which to share their thoughts on those issues with you. Let me start with the Minister Naledi Pandor of South Africa. Honorable Minister, obviously, I think for all the panel, the panelists, the issues when we're looking at the African continent and the world in the post-COVID-19 crisis, as I said, a lot of the issues were raised and addressed by the presidents this morning. But obviously, health strategies for our continent to come out of this, the issues of vaccine nationalism, and the impact of some of the measures that are being taken by countries, lockdowns, and and travel bans and so forth, and what impact that's going to have going forward. We're seeing a rise in the conflict in the continent, insurgencies, whether that's a coincidence or there's a cause and effect, which is also addressed today. Politically also, we have stresses in a lot of countries, coups d'etat, and demonstrations, civil strife in a number of African countries at the moment. And in fact, in some cases, people are asking whether we're going back to the Cold War with concerns about mercenaries and so forth in some African countries. And of course, the huge stress and challenges, economic challenges, that have been added to a number of, to all our countries in Africa, the informal sector suffering, businesses, services, the inflation, unemployment, food insecurity, all these as consequences of COVID. So, Honourable Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, now these travel bans that we're seeing, what's your take on them in terms of how necessary they really are, and the impact also on the relations between countries around the world? How do you feel that Africa should be really addressing and responding to these. And also, things like manufacture of vaccines on the continent. What are the challenges that you see with that? South Africa, of course, is one of the countries that is, out there as a possible hub for vaccine production on the continent. What's your views on how to go about that? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister Nyama, for the questions, and good afternoon to all the delegates and to my colleagues, the distinguished ministers on the panel. I think that the response to the questions you have posed is perhaps best begun by saying that what COVID-19 has illustrated to us as Africans is we continue to be too dependent on others, and that this must be brought to an end. I think for me that's the first lesson, that we need to draw from this the concern that despite significant strides that we have made as a continent, and one can't neglect that, we have made great advances. However, we continue to be dependent. And so what I think we should have as the statement of delegates coming out of this conference, in terms of just establishing appropriate stability and security on the continent, we need to say never again. Never again will we be at the back of the queue. Never again are we going to wait for donations. Never again are we going to be dependent on someone else to ensure that we get the appropriate treatment. It's absolutely imperative that we make that decision, and not just a mental decision, but a practical decision, that it is followed by clear actions. I believe that the production of vaccines and broadly pharmaceutical goods is absolutely important for the continent. We are making strides, as I have said. In many of our countries, we now have free education for our children, at minimum up to secondary schooling. And in some countries, as in South Africa, we support children from poor families to attend higher education institutions and to receive state bursaries for that. We are training more young people up to postgraduate level and ensuring that they achieve masters and doctorates and acquire research skills. But we don't innovate. We don't invest in developing new products, new health products, new vaccines, innovated by us, created by our scientists, and produced in our own institutions. That is where we've got to get. You cannot have security when you depend on somebody else. What happens when that person you depend on is no longer interested in you, when you're not worth much to them? They will leave you to sink. And so I believe developing our own, as our president said earlier, our capacity to produce these resources is critical. What does this mean? Firstly, we are gathered here, many of us are ministers, so we're in government. We cannot afford to continue to neglect higher education and science. We need to establish a significant number of research institutions on the continent. A third point is that one of the lessons that we learned with respect to the economic impact of COVID-19 when we had the lockdowns was when we opened up, many of us as governments did not have the ability financially to support businesses to recover. This is because in many of our countries, we had a very weak insurance sector. So we have to build a robust support mechanism that is able to respond to disasters and to help businesses to recover following a crisis such as the pandemic. So I think ensuring that we put in place the appropriate mechanisms, and these would be done primarily by the private sector, but having that in place is important. A fourth point is many people in our country certainly lost their jobs during the lockdowns that we had, during the restrictions that we had. Millions of jobs have been lost. So people needed a social security net. We were fortunate we were able to provide a small net, but it was not good enough. So we need to look at the social security reform in our country so that when our people are totally vulnerable and in need of assistance, we are able to help them. Then I think we must develop global partnerships that have a connection to the outcomes that we desire. We have many partnerships, but they tend to be general. They are not linked to institution building, to capacity building, to industrialization, to the development of a strong manufacturing base in Africa. We have to look at what it is we desire from the partnerships that we establish with the rest of the world. Because the time to achieve increased equity of ability is here. And I think if Africa were to begin to use international collaboration in a far more strategic fashion, we would actually do very, very well. Finally, I think this is the opportunity to look at how we utilize the very rich mineral resources of Africa for its development. We keep talking about industrialization as though it's an amorphous concept, but it is a real concept that we can make progress on. We have the largest deposits of platinum in the world, but we export most of it, and we buy back value-added products. Other parts of Africa have gold and diamonds. They have the best ferrochrome in the world. Why are we not value-adding? Because that is industrial-based manufacturing. So I think out of COVID-19, let's learn the lessons and let us conclude never again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So more investment, research and development, innovation in particular, which we're not seeing again, but most importantly, self-reliance and building the basis for that self-reliance. Thank you very much indeed, Honorable Minister. Donc, Jean-Yves Le Drian, je viens vers vous. Il y a quelques mois, en mai, votre président, le président Macron, a organisé, abrité cette conférence internationale sur l'Afrique et le financement de l'Afrique post-Covid. Et quelque chose, une des initiatives qu'il voulait voir, c'était ce qu'on appelle en anglais Special Drawing Rights, SDR, de FMI, de Fonds monétaire international. Ils ont parlé de cela aussi aujourd'hui, un des présidents, et pour que l'Afrique, qui maintenant a 33 milliards de ce droit pour emprunter, et maintenant qu'on puisse avoir au moins 100 milliards de dollars pour les Africains, pour les pays africains, et le fait aussi que l'intérêt que l'Afrique paye pour la dette était trop. Et après le Covid et tout le défi de Covid, on a estimé que c'était vraiment trop lourd pour l'Afrique. Où est-ce qu'on est avec cette initiative? Et aussi, on voit que la France est en train de diminuer dans certaines manière les soldats, la présence militaire dans l'Afrique Sahel. Est-ce que ça va? Quel est le but, quelle est la stratégie autour de cela? Vous avez la parole.
Merci Geoffrey. Bonjour aux uns et aux autres. Je suis très heureux de me retrouver ici. C'est mon 7e forum de Paix et Sécurité, puisque j'avais eu la chance d'être là dès la première édition en 2014. Et les sujets que nous avions mis sur la table en 2014 se sont renforcés dans leur prégnance et dans leur urgence et dans leur ampleur depuis cette date. Mais nous avons pu ensemble, je crois, par ces forums, prendre conscience de la complexité des menaces, mais aussi de la force des liens qui nous lient face à ces défis nouveaux. Et tout cela, c'était avant la Covid, mais déjà le terrorisme était là. Et cet esprit de partage de nos appréciations de la situation géopolitique était tout à fait au centre de ce premier forum en 2014, et il est toujours aujourd'hui. À un moment particulier où finalement, en ce qui concerne mon pays, nous nous préparons à assurer au 1er janvier prochain la présidence de l'Union européenne et par ailleurs, au niveau de l'Union africaine, le président Macky Sall sera le prochain président de l'Union africaine. Et il y a donc là une synergie à trouver ensemble dans ce contexte très particulier où nous devons conjuguer en permanence solidarité et souveraineté. La solidarité doit être permanente, la souveraineté doit être exigeante, et c'est sur ce double thème de solidarité et de souveraineté que nous souhaitons voir se développer le prochain sommet Union européenne-Union africaine qui se déroulera à la mi-février à Bruxelles, au niveau des chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Les différents continents ont engagé, puisque le sujet c'est aussi la situation post-Covid, même si la Covid est toujours présente, des plans de relance très significatifs. C'est le cas de l'Union européenne, le président Michel vous en a parlé ce matin, c'est le cas aussi des États-Unis. Et la question que nous devons nous poser au moment du sommet de l'Union européenne et de l'Union africaine, c'est comment est-ce que l'on va ensemble, dans un partenariat, établir un plan de relance du continent africain. Et je vois à ce sujet toujours la déclinaison solidarité et souveraineté. Il nous faudra la mettre en œuvre d'abord sur les questions de santé. Sur les questions de santé qui a été évoquées par ma collègue d'Afrique du Sud, nous avons un triple challenge à mener. D'abord, le challenge au niveau de la solidarité, c'est la livraison des vaccins et le fait que tout pays africain puisse être en situation de pouvoir vacciner l'ensemble de sa population. Nous sommes, je dirais, nous les Européens, et nous la France, je crois, au rendez-vous. Parce que vous savez, en matière de dons de vaccins, il y a deux catégories d'acteurs. Il y a ceux qui annoncent et ceux qui livrent. Ce ne sont pas toujours les mêmes. J'entends depuis le début de la crise beaucoup d'annonces, parfois même des annonces très spectaculaires. Mais lorsqu'on regarde les livraisons, ce ne sont pas obligatoirement ceux qui ont annoncé fort qui sont au rendez-vous. En tout cas, en ce qui nous concerne, nous sommes au rendez-vous. Parce que l'Union européenne s'est donné pour objectif de donner 700 millions de doses d'ici la mi-2022, une bonne partie étant affectée à l'Afrique. Et aujourd'hui, il y a déjà eu 45 millions de doses livrées. Et dans cet effort-là, la France a été au rendez-vous, puisque déjà, de la part de la France, il y a 14 millions de doses livrées aux pays africains, et nous nous sommes donné comme objectif d'atteindre 120 millions de doses d'ici la mi-2022. Ça, c'est la solidarité concrète et pas uniquement la solidarité d'annonce. Mais le deuxième défi, c'est celui de la souveraineté. J'ai parlé sans arrêt solidarité, souveraineté. La souveraineté, c'est le fait qu'il y ait une souveraineté vaccinale en Afrique. Et c'est bien à l'initiative de l'Union africaine dans le cadre du partenariat pour la fabrication de vaccins en Afrique et de l'Union européenne qui a souhaité l'accompagner et de la France qui a été souvent à l'initiative que nous sommes en train d'organiser en partenariat concret la mise en œuvre de hubs de transfert de technologie. C'est le cas en particulier en Afrique du Sud, où le président Macron a signé lors de son déplacement récent un engagement pour faire en sorte qu'il y ait un hub de transfert de technologie de l'ARN messager, à la fois par le partenariat avec Biovac au Cap et avec Aspen dans la province du Cap oriental, pour contribuer en partenariat à l'accession à la souveraineté vaccinale de ce pays. Mais c'est vrai aussi pour le Sénégal, puisque ce matin je me rendais à l'Institut Pasteur de Dakar, où nous avons établi un partenariat permettant aussi, dans le cadre du programme Madiba, de contribuer à cette souveraineté sanitaire indispensable. Et un des rendez-vous de la relance, ce sera celui-là. Et c'est vrai qu'il y a ensuite d'autres sites potentiels. Je pense au Caire, on parlera mieux que moi. Je pense aussi au Rwanda, je pense au Ghana. Avec ce réseau des hubs de transfert de technologie, alors l'Afrique pourra arriver à sa souveraineté vaccinale et l'enjeu de cette relance sera en grande partie celui-là et ce sera une conséquence positive de difficultés majeures que nous traversons dans la lutte contre la Covid. Puis le troisième sujet, c'est de faire en sorte que les vaccins arrivent aux destinataires, car il ne suffit pas d'avoir des vaccins, à la limite, il ne suffit même pas d'en produire, il faut encore que l'affectation soit réelle et que sur le terrain, ces vaccins soient non seulement reçus, mais opératoires. Et en Afrique comme en Europe, nous avons ce souci d'inciter à faire en sorte que les gens se vaccinent, de faire un travail de conviction pour que l'ensemble de cette problématique-là, de partenariat, soit vraiment opératoire. Et pour répondre à l'incitation de Geoffrey, je voudrais dire deux choses complémentaires. On ne pourra pas envisager une relance sur quelque territoire que ce soit, mais singulièrement sur le territoire africain, sans que l'enjeu de la sécurité soit mis au centre. On voit bien l'aggravation des risques, des menaces, avec à la fois le terrorisme djihadiste qui ne cesse pas et qui s'est même répandu dans des régions jusqu'à présent où il n'était pas actif. On voit aussi les enjeux de l'insécurité maritime. On voit aussi des risques de déstabilisation liés à l'arrivée d'acteurs extérieurs qui exploitent ou accentuent la fragilité des États. Et dans ce domaine-là, comme dans le domaine de la santé, il faut à la fois un partenariat de solidarité et un partenariat de souveraineté. Un partenariat de solidarité, c'est la réponse des Européens à la demande de soutien que formulent les pays africains en risque et en menace. Je pense à l'opération Takuba qui a été évoquée ce matin par la ministre des Armées, la ministre française des Armées. Je pense au soutien politique et matériel que nous pouvons apporter aux initiatives, aux capacités africaines de paix et de sécurité, ce qui paraît indispensable. Et au-delà de cela, il nous faut faire en sorte qu'il y ait acquisition de souveraineté pour que les pays africains se dotent eux-mêmes de capacités d'action propres. C'est le cas, par exemple, de l'Académie internationale de lutte contre le terrorisme que nous avons initiée ensemble à Abidjan. C'est le cas de l'École nationale de cybersécurité à vocation régionale de Dakar. Nous allons aller voir tout à l'heure avec Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères du Sénégal. C'est le cas aussi des initiatives que nous prenons pour la stabilisation des pays du G5 Sahel. Tout cela, s'inscrit dans la durée et c'est l'acquisition de souveraineté. Et puis on retrouve le même débat entre la solidarité et la souveraineté dans le domaine économique. Vous avez fait référence, cher Geoffrey, à l'initiative du président Macron et d'autres dans le cours du sommet qui s'est tenu au mois de mai à Paris sur le financement des économies africaines et sur la mobilisation des DTS. le renforcement, le partage pour atteindre 100 milliards de dollars pour les économies vulnérables. Et nous allons, j'espère, nous mobiliser pour être au rendez-vous. Et à ce moment-là, faire en sorte, la France l'est, puisque nous avons décidé d'affecter une partie de notre propre attribution de droits de tirage spéciaux à l'ensemble de l'économie africaine. J'ai pu constater que la Chine, qui était récalcitrante, vient de dire oui, de son côté, très bien. Donc on va arriver, je pense, progressivement à atteindre les 100 milliards de dollars pour l'investissement. Et c'est aussi dans le même état d'esprit que nous avons agi sur l'aménagement de la dette pour que les créanciers émergents se coordonnent avec les créanciers du Club de Paris pour permettre la relance. Ce seront des enjeux essentiels pour faire en sorte que le sommet entre l'Union européenne et l'Union africaine de février soit vraiment non seulement un sommet de la relance, mais aussi un sommet d'un New Deal entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. Je sais que beaucoup le souhaitent et je pense que nous pourrons être ensemble au rendez-vous.
Très bien. Merci beaucoup. Effectivement, donc la solidarité et la souveraineté au cœur de toutes les initiatives françaises et Union européenne. Très bien, formidable. Okay, so now I will ask Samik Shukri, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. Of course, the two challenges now that we are seeing on the African continent post-COVID, we're seeing a lot of instability on the continent. Civil strife, a number of unconstitutional changes of government on the continent, terrorism still on the rise, insurgencies. How do you see this? How can we deal with this? 2020 was supposed to be under the African Union 2063 agenda, the silencing of the guns on the continent. But we're seeing the opposite, if anything else. And then, you know, the political stability that we had been working so hard towards, we're now seeing that being challenged enormously. What is your take? And also in the context of COVID, your president has just finished a couple of years ago his tenure as chairman of the African Union. What's Egypt's also, you know, strategy vis-a-vis the whole COVID challenge that we're all facing? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. First of all, let me take this opportunity to convey my appreciation to the government of Senegal for the organization of this Dakar Forum, an opportunity for us to discuss issues of concern not only to the continent, but generally in terms of international world order and the impact of the maintenance of international peace and security. The excellent organization and the quality of today's panels at the level of heads of state was remarkable. Undoubtedly, the challenges that we have faced by the pandemic exceed the health challenges, although the health dimension is of absolute importance because it affects the daily lives of individuals, whether on the continent or internationally, and it does have a psychological impact on how we can deal with it. I think it has highlighted that on the one hand, the world is certainly a small village, and that there is no recluse to try to protect against a virus of this nature, a pandemic of this nature, and how it has spread globally, and that there is a need to work in solidarity within the continent and without to address this issue. And there is no way that unilateral action can be deemed as appropriate or consequential in being able to meet these challenges related to this pandemic. So other than its health impacts and security impacts, there is also the socioeconomic impacts that have resulted, and that they have all comprised a perfect storm in how we have dealt with the ensuing rise of conflict, of instability, of terrorist organizations taking advantage of the vacuums that have been created to extend on the basis of dissatisfaction and on the basis of the inabilities and the vulnerabilities and the capacities of states to deal with these issues and to provide an alternative path. For all of these reasons, I think, again, we have to highlight the importance of a more comprehensive approach to this development that takes into account all of the various dimensions and is able to address them in a pertinent and potent manner. While we have to recognize at the same time that we don't all have the same capabilities and capacities, and I think we have discussed this quite extensively in the differentiations that exist between the developing and the developed world and what responsibilities have to be shouldered by both sides. But let me also refer to the fact that we need to also address some of our own deficiencies when it comes to dealing with these issues. We have recognized that there is a deficiency in our medical infrastructure on the continent that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed within the context of the complementarity that exists and our relationships and partnerships beyond the continent. But certainly it's an area that has to be looked upon with greater vigor. The other issue is the recovery, and I think the recovery has to also be addressed in the context that the pandemic is still with us, and we see from the variants that are being discovered that this isn't necessarily going to be resolved by the discovery of vaccinations or the expansion of vaccinations or medications for that matter, but that this is an issue that we might have to deal with for the immediate future, and thereby we need to look at and address the potential of having to deal with it. And here the recovery is absolutely vital, and the resources that have to be directed towards the recovery, especially as the presidents mentioned this morning, that the developing world has had the opportunity to inject a great deal of stimulus in terms of resetting their economic plans, but also had been able to address the health conditions through closing down that there were compensations that certainly we couldn't provide as developing countries, and we could not sustain any long-term closures because of the nature of our economies and as well the lack of resources. So in this issue is also vital to be addressed with the financial institutions, with the available resources, and in the spirit of, again, solidarity and the distancing from unilateral actions. For a country which depends on 10% of its GDP on tourism, we cannot afford that this continues to be a case of unilateral action, of sanctions and closures and restrictions on travel that are not really based on any scientific data. At the same time, I think we have demonstrated over this last year and a half to 2 years our ability to sustain our social fabric and relationships and interactions through measures like we are all now demonstrating in terms of masks, in terms of vaccinations, in terms of testing, and have provided those sets of precautionary measures so as to enable our economies to continue to thrive on tourism and providing an outlet that is important at a psychological level for individuals who have been somewhat constrained over this last year and the impact that has caused, the mental impact on especially children. So we need to be able to deal in a confident manner where we can deal with the challenges in a way that does not hamper our abilities to sustain the livelihoods of our populations. In the security dimension, undoubtedly there has been pressures that relating to the socioeconomic pressures that has instigated and exasperated the environment that has become conducive to greater turmoil, whether internal turmoil or that of terrorism or insurgencies, or a sense of agitation that has resulted from the dynamics of the COVID and its continuance. Whenever there's a vacuum, there has to be something that fills that vacuum. And unfortunately, it is usually the organizations that are working outside the usual authority of the state that take most advantage of the situation and utilize the instability that exists to further promote their interests. But we have to also recognize that before the COVID, our continent had its maybe more than its share of unresolved conflicts that have been extended over decades without a sufficient resolution. I think the efforts of the African Union and the efforts of the international community in resolving these conflicts have not resulted in the necessary progress, but that has also led us to highlight that these situations have been exacerbated by the COVID and need to be further addressed in a more structured and substantial manner, so as to be able to provide the environment where we can deal with the health and the socioeconomic dimensions associated with the COVID in a more impactful manner. We have to, I think, again, rely on what Jean-Yves referred to as solidarity and the sovereignty between both Africa and its international and partners, but in doing so, we have to also take into account that there has to be a continuous open dialogue between the two sides, so as to put on the table those issues in a frank and constructive manner that goes beyond the national or limited interests of one side to try to supersede those interests of the other. I believe that if we are true to what we advocate in panels as this, and take this to a higher stage of relationships, both multilateral and bilateral, we can overcome and find the necessary equilibrium, but it has to be on the basis of mutual respect, recognition of the diversity that exists, and the need to deal with issues related to the stability and security of not only the continent but internationally, from that perspective of a divergence of conditions, and thereby we have to take those into account. We are not going to use the same yardstick when we do not have started from the same position of abilities and resources. And thereby, we have to recognize those differentiations, those characteristics, and deal with them from a practical perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Samik, for that. I think solidarity, absolutely coordination, and and also self-reliance. I think are points that came out there. Robert, Deputy Secretary of State of the U.S. For African Affairs. In a few days, President Biden will be convening a meeting, a summit of democracies, so clearly that's within this whole COVID conflict and other global issues. That's a priority for the U.S. Governance and other issues. maybe you might want to also just explain the vision in terms of that and how that keys into the challenges that Africa is facing today. And also, I think President Biden has also announced huge numbers of vaccines that are going to be made available to developing countries, very impressive numbers. But we also know that you're having your booster vaccines, and a lot of African countries are not even finished with their first ones. So how do you see, what's the U.S. Vision or global vision, well, Africa vision, and in terms of that, and also the conflict situations in the African region? Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Minister Onyema. That is a wide set of questions, even though there are only two. Let me begin with the first one. I think, earlier in our discussion, we talked about whether or not COVID has had an impact on kind of democratic institutions and the strength of our systems. And I think the answer, while not quantifiable, is yes, absolutely. It has eroded, it has caused populations to sometimes question the abilities, or even to see the abilities of their governments to respond. It's made it very difficult. So I think with that as a background, but not as a single driver of this, the Summit of Democracies idea is to re-examine and to take a look at what it is that makes democracies powerful, able to produce for their citizens, able to underpin security aspirations of citizens, and that democracies do have inherent in them an ability, because of their openness, because of the strength of their institutions, to do that. Now, none of them are perfect, and I think the question that comes into the conference, obviously, is also how do we, the experiment in the United States continues. I think, France helped us become independent a while ago, but since that moment, our experiment in democracy has continued. And I think that the discussion that the president will be launching with the other leaders is a discussion of what it is to be a democracy, what the strengths are, and what the challenges are that we all face together. That's just kind of a top-line response. I think beyond that, if I can jump in real quickly on this question of solidarity, because I think that's a powerful theme that was raised. Just to indicate, at this point, the United States has provided about 75 million doses. One can question, what's the number, but that's a very significant amount of doses that have come into Africa. I went out to the airport in the long way to welcome one of those COVAX flights to come in, and it was a joyous moment in that country. So I think, although we can question the numbers, we shouldn't underestimate the impact that has, also psychologically. And I think the question of COVID and the psychological impact, are we alone in dealing with this, is a huge one. And I think that this sense of solidarity that others, no matter who they are coming to help. And the United States certainly participates in that. And I think that has a positive impact. Really quickly to follow on, Aspen PharmaCare and the Institut Pasteur, ici, are also being supported by the United States as part of a group. I think EU, African Development Bank, we're providing $113 million to Aspen, because I think the idea of vaccines produced in Africa for Africans is powerful, it's needed, the president supports it, and we're certainly supporting it with our resources as well. So, kind of hopping along, if I can continue, I think my final points are the following, in looking at this kind of in concentric circles. So if we take a look at the immediate need for solidarity, whether it's through the provision of vaccines or through the provision of safety and security in the Sahel, and we are proud to join with the Sahelian governments and with France in addressing the terrorism threat in that region. I think you take a look at those are the immediate issue sets. What we're also doing is building out health systems and strengthening them around the continent. COVID has forced us to take a look at our laboratories, our systems, and to strengthen them. And I think that will project into the future. And the final point then is coming back to the point made by Minister Pandor is, how do you grow your economy to take advantage of that? So if you're starting to to see it strengthening the health sector, how do you add to it so that every sector starts to rise up? And I would just point out that there are a number of initiatives talking about the financing. My final point, there's the Build Back Better world. G7, hundreds of billions of dollars available in the coming years for low and middle income countries. Our Development Finance Corporation has $60 billion available just primarily here in sub-Saharan or in Africa. Our MCC programs, $500 million just in Senegal right now, to take a look at power. If you add all these things together, you do start to see, in partnership, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. Some of the fastest growing economies in Africa are in West Africa. And we want to participate in that. So it is a question of partnership as well. So that's a little run through all the issues that you brought up. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you very much. I think that's well put. So there's real coherence to your approach with democracy, solidarity, the psychological impact, the support, and the support most importantly. Thank you very much indeed as well. So over to WHO, Ibrahima Sokefal, Assistant Director General at the World Health Organization. ADG, right from the onset of the COVID pandemic, the WHO was already in conflict, one would say, with a number of member states, right from the the start. And I think that one of the unfortunate aspects of this pandemic is that there doesn't seem to be global leadership, not necessarily the fault of WHOs, but it would have been ideal if there was, WHO is supposed to be the leader in health globally, and it's just a shame somehow that the member states are not all following the lead of WHO. And we see this most starkly with the issues of travel bans and other things like that, where WHO is coming out and saying what the global best practice should be, and countries are just doing what they want. So what are the challenges and what's bringing this about from the perspective of the organization? And then we see that also, with, for instance, we had a situation with these vaccinations where some parts of the world will suddenly announce that only vaccinations from certain parts of the world will be recognized and or registered, and vaccinations from other parts, even if they're the same make, may not be recognized, and WHO is out there saying no, that they are all, been validated by the WHO and should be recognized by these countries. So how can we address, these conflicting positions that countries are taking, which is often at variance with, even WHO's, positions, and then maybe also what WHO is doing with regards to clearly distribution of vaccines is an issue. We're seeing vaccine nationalism in terms of supporting countries in Africa, for instance, to start manufacturing, vaccines and negotiating with WTO for waivers and intellectual property waivers and so forth. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to speak in French while in
C'est
Senegal, my home
vrai,
country.
vous êtes français, je suis désolé. Oui, j'espère que vous m'avez compris. En tout cas, vous avez l'interprète.
Très bien.
Très bien, ok.
Merci beaucoup. Je remercie d'abord les autorités sénégalaises pour m'avoir invité à avoir l'occasion de revenir dans mon pays pour cette importante rencontre. Et comme vous l'avez si bien dit, au début de la pandémie, il y a eu beaucoup de défis en termes de reporting pour que les pays rapportent à temps. Je pense qu'il y a un instrument international que nous appelons le règlement sanitaire international qui exige donc aux pays de pouvoir déclarer les épidémies, mais aussi tout virus qui a été détecté dans ces pays. Et ce règlement sanitaire international aussi exige des capacités au niveau des pays en termes de détection, de prévention et de réponse aux épidémies. Mais il faut reconnaître qu'il y a eu beaucoup de défis en termes de reporting, surtout à temps. Et ce n'est pas seulement dans certains pays, même dans les pays développés. Durant les premières semaines, nous avons eu beaucoup de défis pour avoir les informations à temps. Et il est extrêmement important d'avoir ces informations pour protéger le monde. Si vous avez vu, quand le séquençage du virus a été publié en Chine, une semaine après, nous avons pu produire les premiers tests de diagnostic avec l'hôpital La Charité en Allemagne, qui nous a permis d'approvisionner plus d'une centaine de pays pour pouvoir les détecter. Et justement, c'est à cause des contraintes que nous avons vues au niveau du règlement sanitaire international qu'aujourd'hui, une discussion internationale est en cours. Nous avons eu une session spéciale de l'Assemblée mondiale de la santé la semaine passée et focalisée sur la prévention et la préparation et la réponse aux pandémies. Et un groupe intergouvernemental est en train d'être constitué pour négocier donc ce instrument international, et j'en appelle aux pays africains justement qui sont 54 parmi les 194 États membres de l'OMS de jouer le plein rôle dans cette diplomatie sanitaire mondiale pour qu'on puisse régler en même temps ces questions de travel ban, parce que nous avons vu avec les nouveaux variants, beaucoup de pays africains sont en train donc, de subir ce travel ban, ce qui est complètement injuste et contraire au règlement sanitaire international. Et au début de l'épidémie aussi, il y a eu des réactions paradoxales qui ont même accéléré l'épidémie. Certains pays qui se sentaient suffisamment puissants sont partis récupérer leurs ressortissants. Il s'agit pratiquement d'aller importer le virus et de l'amener chez soi et accélérer la transmission. Et c'était complètement donc, contraire au règlement sanitaire international. Et donc aujourd'hui, donc, nous travaillons avec tous les États membres. Il y a eu beaucoup de leçons apprises qui vont nous servir dans le cadre de cet instrument contre les pandémies. Il y a des piliers globaux qu'on doit revoir aujourd'hui. Donc tout ce qui est surveillance globale, depuis l'alerte, la vérification et la détection, je pense que c'est un volet extrêmement important. Le volet sur l'approvisionnement en produits biomédicaux, en médicaments et vaccins. Et quand on parle d'approvisionnement dans le domaine de la santé publique, il ne s'agit pas seulement donc, de transporter les biens. Ça part de l'identification des meilleurs produits, du contrôle de qualité, de la sélection et jusqu'au point d'utilisation. Quand on envoie, par exemple, des extracteurs d'oxygène, si le personnel ne sait pas l'utiliser, il ne va pas sauver donc, grand monde. Et au-delà de ça, nous avons aussi mis en place ce qu'on appelle le Hub pour Pandemic Intelligence en Allemagne aujourd'hui, qui va faire un travail de coordination de différents réseaux pour avoir un système d'alerte précoce par rapport aux pandémies, même avant que ça ne soit déclaré. Et dans le cadre aussi du renforcement des pays africains pour la production de vaccins, notre équipe de régulation travaille avec donc, tous ces pays, l'Afrique du Sud, le Sénégal, le Rwanda, le Kenya, l'Ouganda et d'autres pour mettre en place toutes ces capacités et le système de régulation qui va avec, parce que les vaccins et les médicaments, c'est des produits qui sont administrés aux êtres humains. Il est important que le système de régulation soit en place pour accompagner cette production. Donc nous travaillons avec l'ensemble de ces pays. En termes d'acceptation des vaccins, dans le cadre d'urgence, nous avons une procédure d'urgence qui permet d'utiliser ce qu'on appelle Emergency Use Listing. Donc c'est une autorisation d'urgence pour des produits qui répondent aux critères d'efficacité, mais aussi de tolérance. Dans cette procédure accélérée, nous faisons même des visites de terrain pour aller vérifier les bonnes conditions de manufacture. Donc les pays qui veulent refuser certains vaccins sont complètement à côté de la loi. C'est complètement injuste et on se trouve dans une situation où non seulement les pays à faible revenu se trouvent en travel ban, mais aussi quand on refuse des vaccins qui sont administrés, on a l'impression qu'on est en train d'isoler un groupe de pays. Je pense que la solidarité internationale doit refuser cela et nous le dénonçons tout le temps et nous continuons à le dénoncer. Merci.
Très bien. Merci beaucoup. Oui, c'est un grand défi pour vraiment trouver un consensus international dans ce cadre. Mais très bien, merci beaucoup. Then the last panelist, but not the least, Madam Finda Koroma, the Vice President of the Economic Community of West African States. You're welcome, VP Koroma. Now, ECOWAS has been very dynamic during this whole COVID challenge. And of course, you have WAHO, West African Health Organization. So how have you been able to really manage the COVID situation in West Africa? And I think that it's been done very, very efficiently. It's actually one of the sub-regions of the world that has really had, if you can call it that, the best results in terms of the low numbers of COVID. And I think a lot of that is also due to the excellent coordination of ECOWAS. So how have you been able to do that? And then also the conflict situation, it looks as if during this whole COVID period, things are getting a bit more complicated in the ECOWAS sub-region in terms of conflict and governance. So I don't know whether there's a linkage with that and COVID, or whether it's just a coincidence, number of coups during the COVID period. So over to you.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Your Excellency. ECOWAS really has done very well, largely due to the dynamism and leadership of the President of the ECOWAS Commission and the Director General of WAHO. We thought on our feet. As soon as it was evident that COVID was, going to be a problem, ECOWAS Ministers of Health started meeting and coordinating the response. That started in February, even before we had the first case. And then the second thing, we had an extraordinary summit of heads of state and government in April, and His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari was selected as the COVID champion. So that really helped with the first thrust we had. And very quickly, they decided on a few things. One, they agreed that we had to establish humanitarian corridors so that the experts and the goods can get to the member states, even though the borders were closed. They also stated that we should spend 15% of our budgets on the COVID response. And then Nigeria was very magnanimous. They actually made available the cargo planes to distribute, free of charge, all the goods that we were distributing to member states. And I must say, ECOWAS was the first entity to actually deliver all the COVID materials that they needed as soon as that occurred. But beyond that, WAHO has been helping the member states with their national plans and their COVID response. They've also been looking at capacity building to make sure that the data we were receiving was accurate, which was really a problem in other regions we found. They have been training healthcare workers on risks. Contact tracing was also a big issue at the time, but most of all, the Director General was able to take advantage of his relationship with the Africa CDC and UNDP to purchase COVID materials through bulk purchasing. So that saved us a lot of money. And we felt that there was a lot of equity in the distribution because he was able to make sure that each member state, based on the burden of the disease, was able to get a fair amount of share in what they were doing. So the final thing the heads of state also decided was to make sure that there was every 2 or 3 weeks a meeting of ministers of transport, ministers of health, and ministers of finance, because we wanted to make sure that all the entities that were responsible were there. Medium to long term now, we set up a COVID fund. In fact, we had to contribute a month's salary, the entire ECOWAS community institutions, towards a COVID fund. And then we've also set up a COVID vaccination fund. And with funding from a few partners, I know ADB has made available some money to ECOWAS so that we could begin to work on research and development for vaccines. And I'm pleased to note that the Federal Republic of Nigeria and Ghana are potential candidates. Of course, Institut Pasteur here in Senegal, so at least 3 out of our 15 member states would have that. But beyond just the health response, we have also been given food and cereals to the Sahel region from our regional stock reserve, because we felt that vulnerable groups were going to have a problem. Turning to the burning issue of peace and security, I think it's unrelated, but you'd be pleased to know that when the heads of state met on Mali and Guinea, they gave instructions that ECOWAS must modify its protocol, a 20-year-old protocol on democracy and good governance, which is being done, and it will be presented to Council of Ministers. And that has done 3 things. 1, it'll put an end to changes, constitutional changes, that would usher in 3rd terms. It would also prevent, to a large extent, some tinkling with constitutions that are in an arbitrary manner. It would also push for a greater role for women in peace and security. And then it's also putting priority on preventive diplomacy and mediation. Guinea and Mali remain a problem. In fact, during the COVID pandemic, it was very difficult for us to send needed support or even get data from areas that are under occupation in Mali. So COVID just exacerbated that situation even more. We have a summit coming up on the 12th. I think tough decisions are going to be made, and we have already made it very clear to our member states that there is no place for military takeovers anymore in West Africa. We believe that once this protocol on good governance is modified and made to bite, we would begin to see hesitations, in that manner. But I still believe that we still have pockets of problems. Obviously, the threats to peace and security are evolving. There are new threats. The spillover effect of terrorism on coastal areas. We could see that Benin was attacked, the northern part of Benin was attacked recently, and Togo as well. So this is a burning problem. And a few years ago, it happened in Côte d'Ivoire. So that is one of the things we're looking at. So, as a response to that, we're focusing more of our attention on early warning. We have early warning centers in many of the member states now, effectively in 7 out of 15, but by January, I think we would have about 10 or 12. And the challenge for that is that they give the alerts, but it's for the governments to respond. So we're trying to bridge the gap between alerts and response. But, it's still, as His Excellency Bazoum put it, you see the jihadization of criminals and the criminalization of jihadists. Mixed with that is, small arms proliferation. You're also seeing, the unemployed youth getting very jittery. And then the most challenging threat, I believe, that would come from the COVID situation is actually the mistrust, public mistrust on the part of the government. Fake news. They simply do not trust government, and I think that would, if it's unmanaged, it could lead to potential threats to peace and security in the region. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much indeed. Well done. So I think we've done very, very well. 5 minutes left. Just one word from each person. Hopefully something positive, looking forward that we can all expect some, good news or good intentions in about 15 seconds. We'll start with WHO. If you want, you don't have to, if you don't have anything you want to say.
Wow. Merci beaucoup. Je pense que la pandémie du Covid-19 est une crise sans précédent, mais dans toute crise, nous avons malheureusement des victimes, mais aussi une opportunité pour mieux faire. Donc nous devons, en tant que pays africains, aller résolument vers une réforme des politiques de santé. Je ne parle pas du secteur de la santé. Quand on parle de politique de santé, c'est vraiment une politique multisectorielle qui doit englober l'ensemble du gouvernement, tous les segments de la société peut nous permettre d'avoir l'accent sur l'accès universel donc aux soins de santé, le renforcement du système de santé, la sécurité sanitaire pour prévenir tous ces événements aigus de santé publique, mais aussi la promotion de la santé à tous les âges. Je pense que c'est en allant résolument vers ça que nous pouvons prévenir les pandémies futures et ne pas retomber dans ce cycle de panique et de négligence qui fait qu'on oublie tout de suite après les pandémies ce qui s'était passé. Je pense que c'est le moment ou jamais. Merci.
Très bien. Sameh. Good news to go away with.
Well, the good news definitely is, again, to reiterate that on the African continent there is the capacity, whether in Egypt, in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Rwanda, in South Africa, for us to cover the vaccination requirements of the continent, given the opportunity to do so, an opportunity that is in the best interest of the globe. This pandemic will not end except if we all are vaccinated, and we do have the capacity, we do have the know-how and the resources and the abilities, and thereby we look forward, because the contributions that have been made and which we are thankful for certainly do not in any way impact the real needs, not only of the continent but of the developing world, and thereby the abilities exist, but we need the opportunities.
Excellent. South Africa, something positive.
Yeah, something positive. I think, firstly, financial inclusion of women, absolutely important. It's an opportunity we must take up. Women should no longer be at the margins of our economies. Let's find ways of supporting them. Pandemic preparedness, absolutely vital. It's going to happen again. Let's not relax at all. And then incredible African resilience has been illustrated. And Africa was able to respond as Africa. And for me, that was the most amazing plus. So I believe we must build on that unity, that Pan-African unity, and put it to good effect on other initiatives that are oriented toward development.
Excellent, very good. Jean-Yves.
Sur la pandémie et sur les vaccins, moi je me suis exprimé assez longuement tout à l'heure. Je suis optimiste quant à la capacité de livraison de dons pour permettre à l'Afrique d'assumer complètement sa vaccination sur le moment. Je pense qu'on y arrivera avec les initiatives qui sont prises au niveau européen et au niveau de l'Union africaine. Je suis un peu moins optimiste, mais déterminé sur la nécessité d'avoir la souveraineté vaccinale. Je pense que l'exemple de l'Afrique du Sud est un bon exemple, mais l'exemple aussi de Dakar va dans le même sens. Je suis plus inquiet globalement sur les questions d'acheminement. Et je pense que si on ne se focalise pas sur ce sujet-là, on risque de passer à côté de l'enjeu. Et c'est quelque chose de finalement plus compliqué, plus difficile, et sur lequel, je crois, il faudra un partenariat entre l'Union africaine et l'Union européenne qui est sur ce sujet-là qu'à ses balbutiements.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup. Robert Scott.
Thank you so much. I think COVID has almost moved us beyond remembering sometimes what just happened 2 years ago. And I just take us back to our HIV AIDS pandemic and the incredible successes that we've seen around the world on that, especially in this continent. Again, once you've been an ambassador in a country, you have a soft spot for it. So for me in Malawi may, based on the statistics, be the first country in the world to have epidemic control. And that is because of our partnership, our solidarity with each other. And that is hugely positive. As much as we've gone through COVID, if we just take a look back to something that 2 years ago was at the top of our agenda, we've made incredible progress there, and that's because we've all worked so well together. And so I would put that down as something positive to look at. Thank you.
Excellent. ECOWAS.
ECOWAS has 2 or 3 initiatives that are really interesting. First is the Regional Stabilization Fund. We started in the Gambia, we've gone to Guinea-Bissau now, and Mali and Niger, which would create economic opportunities for populations that are vulnerable, but also entrepreneurs. We also just adopted in June this year the ECOWAS Integrated Human Capital Development, because I think this pandemic has shown more than anything the need to develop human capital right across a number of sectors. Of course, it includes financial inclusion and gender transformative action. But most important of all, we are going to be focusing on innovation and technology hubs for women and youth, because in the new normal we're operating in, we cannot be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I thank each and every single one of you. I think your contributions have been excellent. And I go away believing that this is an opportunity or a reminder that we are all one in this world, indivisible, one, and should be our brothers and sisters, keepers going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Merci infiniment donc aux distingués experts et aux autorités qui sont intervenus pour cette première plénière qui nous a permis à nouveau de camper vraiment les enjeux de stabilité post-Covid, les défis sécuritaires, les nouvelles menaces. Donc je pense qu'ils méritent des applaudissements quand même un peu plus nourris. Et je nous invite maintenant à aller approfondir ces questions dans les ateliers. Donc l'atelier 1 qui porte sur le défi sanitaire vers une gestion collective des pandémies est dans la salle 202, en haut de l'escalator. Il y a des personnes qui pourront vous diriger. L'atelier 2, sécurité et développement, impact de la démographie et du changement climatique en Afrique, dans la salle ovale. Et l'atelier 3, nouveaux défis, cybersécurité et lutte contre la désinformation, dans l'atelier 5. Les ateliers sont pour une durée d'environ 1h30 et après, vous pourrez tranquillement rentrer chez vous. Merci. Madame la